Oh, and by the way, you can stop calling me sir. The name's Ratchet.
Pleased to make your acquaintance, sir.
You got a name?
My serial number is V54296.
Oops. I'll just call you Clank for short.
What do you think of when I mentioned a first Ratchet and Clank? Outdated gameplay elements? A Ratchet so mean and insufferable you feel like stuffing your ears with cotton balls every time he speaks? Perhaps, I suppose. But what if I were to tell you that the original Ratchet and Clank is a masterpiece in video game storytelling? What if I were to tell you that Ratchet and Clank has the most beautiful levels I've ever seen in a 3D platformer, creating an atmosphere so rich and seamless it makes the first Jak and Daxter look barren in comparison?
That's an unpopular opinion.
Maybe for some of you this doesn't sound like too strange a statement. After all, the first game still has a solid base behind it. However, there are some coming out of the woodwork criticizing the game for not having aged as well, particularly some of the gameplay elements. Of course, we'll touch these in the review, but after my initial playthrough, I'd argue that the first Ratchet & Clank holds up well despite these aged mechanics. Sure, maybe it has its share of first game issues, but it has enough going for it that it holds up on its own. And yes, you heard me right. I said first playthrough. So a bit of a disclaimer. My Ratchet & Clank journey didn't start with the original PS2 classics. Instead, I began with Size Matters and the Future trilogy. Yes, I'm a sad man. It wasn't until I picked this baby up, the Ratchet & Clank collection. Through this HD remaster, I finally got a taste of what I missed out on, or the first quarter at least. But while this being my initial run of the game may cause me to gloss over certain aspects that would require a second playthrough, perhaps it also prevents me from looking at the original Ratchet & Clank through rose-tinted glasses or nostalgia-blind goggles. So let us prepare our trusted Devastator as we go on a galactic adventure to figure out what made Ratchet & Clank the classic it is today. So, if I were to start with my thoughts on the HD collection, when you boot up the game, you're greeted with this rather simplistic menu. And it's just... is that the title screen for All for One? Well, it looks highly inaccurate considering that Quark is the villain in the first two games, and Dr. Nefarious is never a good guy. When I flip through the games, nothing seems to happen. No special sound effects, no cool scrolling feature. This might sound like a nitpick, but why couldn't they be more like the Jak and Daxter collection, which had a more interesting menu with Jak changing his outfit every time you switched to a different game? But anyway, you're not here to listen to me review the HD collection. Overall, it's a good port, minus the dropping frames and weird animation stutters. I noticed a couple of strange glitches that made me raise an eyebrow, but apparently these were present in the PS2 version, which makes me wonder why they never bothered fixing it in the remaster. Well, that's enough of me being sidetracked, so the story opens with Ratchet trying to fix up a ship in order to leave Veldin. Unfortunately, he's missing
robotic ignition system
and is basically stranded until he finds one. Meanwhile, on a robot factory in Quartu, a computer decides to stop manufacturing its line of sentry bots in favor of a little white robot. He awakens to find an infobot showing him terrifying data. Unfortunately, before he could assess the situation, a sentry bot attacks him, forcing him to board one of their ships to escape, only to be shot down. Sounds like a certain Disney movie I've never heard of. Doesn't help that Kevin Michael Richardson is the voice of the main antagonist. So Ratchet is trying to figure out how to bypass the situation when that same ship crash lands on his planet's surface. He goes to investigate and finds the robotic ignition system he was looking for. However, he finds much more than a means to start his StarCraft. Enter Chairman Drek, who announces that he wants to remove different parts of other planets in order to create his own since his original homeworld has become so polluted. From there, Ratchet and a white robot, who he affectionately calls Clank, needs to find Captain Quark in order to stop Chairman Drek before he can damage any planets. However, twists and turns have our heroes jumping through hoops, and soon they realize they have to put their conflicting differences aside to defeat Drek themselves. For the most part, it might sound like a typical coming-of-age Joseph Campbell story, The bored and rugged hero needs to leave his routine life to respond to his true calling. However, it's the execution that counts. Throughout the different planets you visit, many of the civilians and infobots will give you a glimpse into the destructive nature of Drek's actions.
Newsflash, giant robots attacking! The escape transports are taking all the rich folks off this god-darn planet.
So why aren't you on one?
Socioeconomic disparity.
What?
He hasn't got enough bolts.
We must prepare this planet to be harvested for our new world.
Yes, sir. As you can see, everything is moving along as planned.
The ships are hammering our position from the air! That was a little too close! We need support! Now!
It helps Drek feel like a more immediate threat, even though Ratchet and Clank don't interact with him directly until the end. You watch Drek go from cutting down trees in Eudora to actually threatening to wipe out an entire planet. And the process of his destruction affects the development of the main protagonists. Initially, Ratchet starts out as an uncaring Lombax who only wants to see what the world had to offer. Joining Clank to stop Drak was a means to an end, and he only becomes more uptight later on after Quark betrays them, which he blames Clank for since he was the one who had been fooled in the first place. It isn't until he sees Hoven about to be destroyed he gradually changes his mind to the point that after he finally defeats Quark, he not only understands how empty his initial pursuit of getting revenge on Quark was, but also how bad the situation was becoming.
Look, maybe you were right. This is a lot bigger than you or me. I was really selfish focusing on Quark.
It's here he truly becomes compliant to Clank's wishes. Now, I know when this game came out, quite a few people complained about Ratchet's personality, saying that he was too mean and apathetic. Just take this GameSpy review. Ratchet's personality was a factor in bringing the score down to a 7.8. Now, there are times when he can be on the nose.
We have a little problem. I just want the O2 mask. So if you can't open up the lock, that's your problem. Now cough up the mask.
But for the most part, if I'm being honest, I quite like the way Insomniac depicted Ratchet. Too many times, the modern coming-of-age heroes are do-gooders that immediately focus on what's at stake. Rey Skywalker. Imagine if Ratchet had been so focused on taking out Drek from the beginning. Imagine how boring that would have been for his character. The cool thing with Ratchet in this first entry is that we get to see him go through an arc. We get to see him change from a selfish brat to more of a hero. It's called character development for a reason. It's natural for him to not fit the archetype of a hero in the beginning because the game wants to show how he grows throughout the story, and they don't make his transformation sudden. Ratchet gradually comes to understand the weight of the situation before making his heel face turn. For instance, when he witnesses Drek's plan to destroy a planet, he calls the evil chairman out on it despite the fact he was still so focused on Quark. So it kind of makes him out to be a jerk with a heart of gold.
Now this guy's gonna blow up an entire planet? That's just mean.
That's what I've been telling you.
Look, I'm still gunning for Quark. If we end up taking out Drek too, hey, fine.
On the other hand, Clank, Ratchet's sidekick,
I always thought that you were the sidekick.
or maybe it's the other way around, is a foil to Ratchet. Being the more logical one than Duo, he sees the big picture and tries everything he can to get Ratchet back on course, constantly having to remind him this isn't a vacation. However, he himself doesn't always have his brightest moments, as his single-minded pursuit of stopping Drek can blind him. For instance, he so desperately wants Captain Quark to help them stop Drek that he pulls Ratchet into his trap despite the latter sensing something fishy. Yeah, not one of your smarter moments, Clank. Although, despite the conflict that develops between them, it's nice to see how Clank tries to see the good in Ratchet, despite his frustration.
Ratchet, this is not like you.
What do you know about me? You've spent this whole time looking for Quark. You don't know anything about me.
I know that you will do the right thing.
There's a good amount of chemistry between Ratchet and Clank, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're both opposites. So say what you want about Ratchet being a dick or Clank being one-dimensional, at least the interaction makes up for it, something that a certain other video game duo lacks. I mean, Jak and Daxter was fine, solid even, but their relationship could feel a bit one-sided at times. In the Precursor Legacy, Daxter felt like he received more concentration since Jak was a mute, and then he got relegated to the side as a mere wisecracker without much else, because Jak became a more complex character in the sequels. both Ratchet and Clank find a pretty decent balance in the spotlight. Seeing their personalities clash carried the story forward because it added an extra layer of weight to the plot. These two had to set aside their differences in order to stop an even bigger threat. Every time they argue, Chairman Drek pieces together another chunk of his planet. Insomniac wastes no time in ensuring that you hate this guy. Just listen to him.
Hello, citizens of... My race, the Blog, have a small problem. Our planet has become so polluted, overpopulated, and poisonous that we are no longer able to dwell here. But I, Chairman Drek, have a solution. We are constructing a pristine new world using the choicest planetary components available. So, what does this mean to you might ask? Using highly sophisticated technology, which you couldn't possibly understand, we will be extracting a large portion of your planet and adding it to our new one. Unfortunately, this change in mass will cause your planet to spin out of control and drift into the sun, where it will explode into a flaming ball of gas. But, of course, sacrifices must be made.
Despite the fact that he claims to have a more benevolent purpose, he sounds demeaning, conniving, and someone you wouldn't trust. And looking at all the other cutscenes that include him up to the big reveal at the end, he's definitely up to no good despite him stating otherwise. Thing is, Clank actually thinks he'd go to great lengths for a decent cause.
There must be another way to make a home for your people.
You think that's what this is about? Who do you think polluted our last world? I did.
And honestly, Insomniac Games did a good job at making a villain you'd find in real life. Chairman Drek isn't quite the cackling and evil villain from other 3D platformers. He kind of comes across as one of those celebrities that says they have good intentions, when in reality they want to do things for their own personal gain. Doesn't that sound familiar? Butch Hartman. Kevin Michael Richardson also does a very decent job here. The fact he abandons the toughness of Gontu from Lilo and Stitch in favor of a more eloquent salesman fits the deceptive bad guy trope. Of course, the major foil to Drek is Captain Quark. If you think about it, both of them believe in a means-justify-the-ends approach to their goals, with Drek polluting his own planet to get cash, and Quark working for him in order to increase his fame and fortune. They both hide behind a facade of doing good deeds, as seen with Drek justifying his actions as an attempt to save his planet, and Quark pretending to be a superhero while working with a villain behind the scenes. But the ways they do it differ, since Quark does it out of a sense of insecurity, for Captain Quark doesn't lie to people for a malignant cause. Rather, he does it more because he can't stand the fact people will see who he really is. At the start of the game, he seems to be the main hero of the universe. A lot of the locals, particularly the working class, look up to him to rescue them. Hell, Clank almost immediately requests for Ratchet to find him, but then Quark tricks the duo, and it turns out the supposed savior was a lackey to Drek. However, as the story goes on, you realize Drek has a sense of superiority over him, downright belittling him. And the only reason he serves Drek is not because he believes in his cause, but because he'd do anything to preserve his glory, even if it means doing things he isn't comfortable with. It makes Quark a mysterious figure. Was there a time when he fell from grace? Was he a true hero ever to begin with, or always a con artist? He's definitely the character who I felt the most amount of sympathy for, even with all the terrible things he does to Ratchet and Clank, and I can't tell if that's messed up. Also, I could have sworn his voice sounded familiar.
Today's winners will take home a brand new professional-grade Model T15 Platinum Zoomerator.
So, Danny, you and your little friends want to hunt ghosts.
But it turned out I was confusing Rob Paulson with Jim Ward. Why do I keep bringing up Butcher Heartless?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
In both Captain Quark and Chairman Drek, the main thematic elements of capitalism manifest themselves. In Drek, his motivation to repeat the cycle of polluting his own planet to get paid over and over again is basically the reflection of a narcissistic scumbag, while Quark's false superhero identity demonstrates the more dissatisfied side of it that constantly has people wanting more. Now, I mention this to sort of state that this is a bit of a running theme in Ratchet and Clank. The nature of consumerism is seen in almost all the NPCs. As established early on by the plumber, bolts are basically how one measures the status quo of one another.
Socioeconomic disparity.
What? He hasn't got enough bolts.
So quite a few of them will ask you to make a due payment. Luckily, it doesn't come across as too sleazy. I don't feel like I'm giving cash to a mustache-twirling businessman while breathing in an existential sigh. At least most of these characters have their own quirky personalities. Take the Pokotaro Resort Man, for instance. He doesn't even flinch when Ratchet blows up in front of him.
So if you can't open up the lock, that's your problem. Now cough up the mask.
Well, I can see that you really wanted to fly on jet. So I'll tell you what. Go talk to Bob at his Robo-Shack. He knows about these locks.
His expression almost seems to read, I'm used to the customers acting this way. Comes with the territory. Or how about the scientist that makes all the weapons for Drek? Even after saving his ass from the crawly creatures, he forces you to make a payment for the grind rail boots so that he can find a different job. Then you later run into him in the sewer, where he tries to again make you find raritanium in exchange for the hypnotizer. I feel like he represents the lower, working-class individual who's struggling to make ends meet. Basically, he'll do anything to get bolts so that he can raise his social status. The bouncer character is in a similar situation, albeit a bit more on the nose, since he only gets paid 6 bolts an hour compared to the paparazzi. These kinds of circumstances that Insomniac puts these characters through are surprisingly realistic and reflect the overall capitalist atmosphere of the galaxy. Most of them come from the bottom of the social ladder and are begging you to pay them bolts so that they can be with
all the rich folks.
Despite the sci-fi undertones, Insomniac tries going for a sense of realism in order to add their own subtlety in the game's narrative. Do you understand what I'm saying? No? Honestly, neither do I. Who wrote this script anyway? But who am I kidding? You're not here to listen to me give an English essay on the consumeristic thematic elements and the characters of Ratchet and Clank. No, when you play Ratchet and Clank, you're here for the weapons! So a lot of people complain that the first Ratchet and Clank has too few weapons that were useful by the end of the game. For me, I didn't find this to be an issue. Throughout the game, I used most of my arsenal, and I highlight most. While the blaster and bomb glove were obvious picks, I found the drones to be helpful considering they home in on enemies and take out several of them at once. Sometimes they might even protect Ratchet from enemy fire. In the early game, the Pyrocitor fired a flame beam that covered a solid degree of area, making it good for crowd control. The Suck Cannon had a similar usage, being able to absorb a lot of the smaller enemies and firing them out like missiles. Am I the only one that found a Mind Glove to be practical in some situations? Chucking out quite a few of them and taking advantage of their homing ability can be quite handy when cornered in a room filled with Blarg parachuters. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite say the same for all the weapons. After all, I did say most. The Taunter is rather questionable in its presence. It's supposed to annoy enemies so that they come to you, except why would you want to attract their attention in the first place? Maybe if you lay a couple of homing mines, you could get them to run into them for extra damage, but other than that, it's essentially useless. However, an even bigger problem is the fact you can't strafe in Ratchet and Clank, so most of the time you're forced to take a couple of pot shots before quickly jumping away. There are ranged weapons like the Morpho Ray, which can cover a decent length with its chicken-changing beam, and a Glove of Doom, which can summon little robots that self-destruct to inflict massive damage. But the lack of strafing did make the shooting hard because a lot of the time it forced me to stand still and fire, or it would leave me mucking about trying to dodge enemy attacks while I attempt to get in a good shot. Of course, there's a way to strafe with the thruster pack, but this is so user-unfriendly. To activate it, you have to press R1 twice, then hold down L2. Yeah, not using that. What's worse is that the quick select menu doesn't pause every time you use it, which leaves you pretty much open to attack. Thank God the enemy AI isn't too aggressive in this game. All you have to do is leave their area and they stop following you. This was very useful when I had to switch weapon out with quick select, but it also meant I couldn't engage the enemy in a more direct way. Also, since your quick select is only limited to 8 slots, If you ever need to switch to a gun that isn't in the quick select menu, you have to pause the game and go to the weapon or gadgets grid, which is very disruptive to the action. I can't describe how many times I had to pause the menu because I wanted to switch to Morpho Ray or bring out drones. So yeah, the gunplay isn't the best, so despite the fact the first Ratchet and Clank has a decent variety of weapons, it falls short with using them in combat. However, where the gameplay succeeds is the level design. Ratchet and Clank takes a fairly linear approach to its levels. However, that isn't quite the full story. While it's not quite open-ended, you do have different paths to choose from. In Novalis, you could either take the platform that moves you to the interior facilities of the planet to see the plumber, or you can go into this cave to meet the chairman of Novalis, who thinks you've come to execute him. In Rilgar, you can either take the right path to participate in the galaxy's race, or take the left to achieve the main goal of speaking to Captain Quark. I think the one that stood out to me the most was the volcano you could jump into on planet Gaspar to find a gold bolt. It's just something that isn't so obvious. You might just walk by it thinking that it's just an endless pit, but then a careful observation will show a small body of land barely visible. Also, it feels like something I'd find in a Spyro game, which kind of shows that Insomniac hasn't 100% abandoned the formula of their predecessors. The only planet that is truly straightforward is Umbris, and that one is filled with so much action that it never feels dull. You'll have rapid-fire turrets that you have to deactivate to solve button puzzles, the hydro dispenser sections that require draining a body of water in order to prevent Blargian fish from eating you. Of course, each planet is filled with side content. As mentioned earlier, gold bolts are scattered off the beaten path, and skill points are also obtainable. Usually I got these by accident. Sometimes the game will have you backtrack to obtain an object to continue within a planet, like having to go to Gaspar to collect the pilot's helmet to do the spaceship part in Pokotaru, which in turn gives the O2 mask to explore the toxic fumes in Orxon. This type of implementation of the level design appeals to intrinsic and extrinsic players. Intrinsic players who enjoy exploration will find much fun in the numerous paths they can take. The game might be pushing me to go down this way, but what if I went the other way? It builds the curiosity factor. Extrinsic players will enjoy the fact that every path will reward Ratchet with a new and necessary gadget, like the Trespasser from Aridia and the Suck Cannon from Eudora. It shows how much thought Insomniac put into making the game appeal to all types of people. Finally, I must mention how beautiful and lively these levels are. Here I'd like to clarify a statement I made earlier in the video. The Jak and Daxter levels are still as vibrant and colorful as people say, however, for all the details put into them, they could feel somewhat empty. Every time I watched those minecarts in Fire Canyon, I always felt like there should be a driver behind them, instead of just moving in a circle while the wheels squeak away. However, the levels in Ratchet and Clank are filled to the brim with life. Just look at all these ships when you look out the window of Novalis, or in Metropolis. I just couldn't stop standing over the edge of the bridge, mesmerized by the detail put into the city. I took the liberty of following a blimp across the outskirts of the city, wondering where it went. Of course, it just faded away in plain sight. Overall, most of these planets are breathtaking to go through. In fact, to add to the atmosphere, every time you initially arrive on a planet, you are treated to a scenic view of the level. Maybe if you get up to a high place in Jak and Daxter, you can see a similar landscape, but it's nothing compared to Ratchet and Clank, where you see it as soon as you take those first few steps onto the stage. And by the way, I love the Precursor Legacy. And I might as well cap off this section with my top 5 Ratchet and Clank planets. At the top of the list for number 5, it's Hoven. Yeah, it's a snow level with annoying ice physics, but it has 3 different paths to go down. One of them has you going through a cave doing hydro displacer puzzles, the other leads you to a turret to take down Blargian ships, and a third one has you wrestling with ice physics as you navigate a terrain with the swing shot. Also, it has the more likable and funnier interactions with the NPCs, like Ratchet flirting with Edwina only for her to be more interested in Clank, and Ratchet fixing the miner's drill by slapping it. Number 4 is the Gemlock Space Station. and has the most atmospheric environment, with its main theme really kicking. Also, this is one of the first levels where a weapon is imperative to progress through the stage. The Devastator or the Visibomb Glove are useful to destroying the towers that power the force fields. It's one of the more creative implementations of the weapons in the game, not to mention the boss fight against Captain Quark, which is arguably the best on-rails shooting battle next to Engine from Crash 3. Number 3 is Metropolis. Insomniac nailed the environment once again, making it feel like I was going down an actual train terminal with the stacks of bags, along with the beautiful city. And it's here you meet Al and Helga, two of the most iconic NPCs in the franchise. Number 2 is Novalis. Overall, a great opening level for Ratchet and Clank, I suppose if you don't count Velton. You get to go inside of a cave that eventually leads to the interior facilities of the planet. It's cool because when you reach the top, you get to see all the outer landscape of the planet. And the sweetest thing about it is that you get to explore everything you see below. Finally, number 1 is Orxon. Yes, I know this is a controversial pick, but I like Orxon because it has you play as both Ratchet and Clank. Sometimes when you come back as a Ratchet for a subsequent visit, you might find items or pathways that were previously inaccessible as Clank. Also, I do think this is one of the more experimental levels of the few planets where you play as Clank. Clank will need to traverse Orxon while avoiding grenades falling from towers and navigating a maze where sparks come out of the walls. It's definitely much more involved than what we saw previously with him. And that was my top 5 planets of Ratchet and Clank. I know it's a shit list, but deal with it. And speaking of different planets, there are also a plethora of gameplay styles to complement the running and gunning. Some of these include Ratchet riding in a spaceship shooting down targets. These levels have him using a machine gun and a limited supply of missiles, which can be replenished by shooting down other fighters. They kinda remind me of the dogfighting stages in Crash 3, however, one of these parts where you shoot down spaceships with long tails looks familiar. Then there's the rail shooting sections, and, well, there's nothing special about these. Only 2 exist in the game, one in which the plumber assigns you on Battalia, and the other being on Planet Hoven. They're both by-the-books rail shooting sections. However, I do think the cutscene that plays when you fail in Battalia is funny. It's basically a first-person perspective scene of the plumber waking Ratchet up and telling him to fuck off.
Well, look who's awake. You're lucky I was here to drag your unconscious keister out of that turret. Good news is, I got the cannon fixed again.
And then some of the gadgets give different gameplay styles. The magnet boots allow you to go up surfaces you couldn't on foot. You can't jump, you go slow as fuck, and you can't use any of your weapons. But it's nice seeing the level from a different viewpoint. The grind rail boots allow Ratchet to slide on rails. They do manage to make some of these surprisingly cinematic, like how in the Gadgetron factory you're jumping around, dodging subway trains. Of course, Ratchet doesn't fully steal the spotlight, for there are sections where you can play as Clank. Since he doesn't have the same firepower as Ratchet, he's forced to rely on Gadgetbots to take down the bigger enemies. I noticed the OST reflects the slower pace of these levels, so in a lot of ways, this can be relaxing and a break from the shooting and platforming. The hoverboard sections, on the other hand, can be a real pain. In the initial race on Blackwater City, the board skid gives you is so slow that you have to rely on speed boosts scattered throughout the track to catch up. In the second race on the Gadgetron headquarters, you have the Zoominator, which allows you to gain your own speed boosts by performing tricks, clearly inspired by the skateboarding minigame from Enchanted Towers in Spyro Year of the Dragon. Anyway, Regardless, it's hard to beat the other racers, since it feels they go faster than you, and it's so easy to run into TNTs.
KO!
Finally, there's the Giant Clank and Hollow Disguise. Giant Clank is relatively standard for the most part. It mostly involves smashing everything in your path. I will say that it's pretty satisfying being able to crush all your foes while debris and machinery explode and disintegrate. It almost feels like a bit of an afterthought though, because it's only used twice towards the endgame. The Hollow Disguise also brings its own uniqueness by making Ratchet and Clank feel more centered around stealth. It's mainly used to get around sentry bots in order to prevent them from setting off the alarms. However, the execution isn't very good since it makes Ratchet move too slowly. So for the most part, the different gameplay styles tend to be a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them, like the grind rail sections and the spaceship fights, are good, others, like the Giant Clank and Hollow Disguise, are okay, and the hoverboard and turret sections could have had a second do-over. To a lesser extent, I'd say the same thing about the bosses in Ratchet and Clank. It's kind of laughable how they basically weren't even trying with the first boss. He's the same as one of those other alien critters, except he's bigger. His behavior, more often than not, tends to be identical to them, considering if you stand far away enough from him, he might just stand still for a minute or so. Thankfully, everything afterwards is better. The Snaggle Beast is generally solid. You can't get near him since he'll attack with fireballs, so you have to figure out how to strike from a distance. After he takes enough damage, he'll chase you with a shield around him, in which you lead him to a bridge to have him burn into lava. Overall, it's a good boss, but there could have been more to his attacks. He mostly will do the same I-beam and shockwave attacks, and once in a while he'll scatter your ammo. It would have been more engaging if he changed it up a little bit after each time he fell. But what we got is definitely a step up from this guy. Then there's the Captain Quark spaceship fight. For the most part, his boss battle reminded me of Engine from Crash 3. It basically requires you to shoot down each of the separate engines on Captain Quark's ship. All the while, he fires rockets and his own fleet of ships after you. Sometimes he'll do a close encounter in which you have to focus on the correct missile launcher to fire at, and I especially find it charming how he'll say extra dialogue when you're whittling away at his health.
Hey, Roger, buddy, old pal. Why don't we just call it a day? Let bygones be bygones. You hear me there, Chief? I've always liked you, kiddo. I was just following orders.
Also, I have to compliment the soundtrack during this fight. It brings such an ominous, dreary feeling to the battle in order to describe the catharsis of Ratchet's long-awaited thirst for vengeance on Captain Quark. Finally, you have the final boss fight with Chairman Drek. The pacing of the battle puts this up there with the likes of Dark Yabu from Vex. First, you have a rather anticlimactic battle as Giant Clank, in which Drek will shrink him down, and you'll be forced to continue on as Ratchet. You'll be moving from platform to platform, while Drek will amp up his weaponry with each encounter. After starting out with shock grenades, he'll eventually move to homing missiles, tracking mines, and lasers. Most of this footage is me surviving, but I died a lot during this fight. The best weapon to use is probably the Devastator, while using the Glove of Doom and drones to take out the missiles and mines. However, since their ammo is so limited, I'd recommend getting up in his face and shooting him like a little bitch with the blaster. An arduous fight for sure, but one quite rewarding. For you get an ending that really does a good job at tying the knot. It doesn't set up for a sequel or anything like that, it just brings it all to a close. So Chairman Drek's suit blows up as he crash lands onto his own incomplete planet. From there, Clank realizes that the deplanetizer was no longer facing Veldin and now flipped to Drek's home world. By pushing down on the activation button, they end Drek's created planet once and for all. I've actually never seen a game end like this. It doesn't finish with the final boss, Rather, to complete the game, you need to power slam a button, like it's a final signature to show you've beaten it. The deplanetizer is destroyed, and Clank's arm is damaged in the process of saving Ratchet. From there, it looked like the two were going to part ways. However, in a twist of fate...
Hey, Tin Can! Where do you think you're going? We, still need to fix that arm.
So the question still stands. Is Ratchet and Clank the classic it once was? Yes. Yes, it is. The gameplay still holds up on its own despite problems with the shooting. The beautiful level designs accompanied with their multiple pathways are just asking to be explored to find collectibles like gold bolts or skill points. The weapons are creative enough that you want to try all of them, giving more variety to the combat, and the story is solidly paced with excellent character development between the two protagonists. Overall, Insomniac really hit the ground running with this one. It did so well that it actually set up for a pretty darn good sequel. Well, that was weird. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, or leave a comment down below. And without further ado, I'll see you all next time.
So, that's basically how you're going to end?